What's going on, Hot Take Nation? Before we start this week's show, I want to introduce a company and a personal friend of mine, Steve Moore, who I've coached hockey with. Our kids play hockey. He's been a longtime friend, and he is with Magnum Cementing Services, which has been a top-tier well cementing specialist for over 13 years, as well as providing plug and abandonment services. And boy, have they pumped a lot of cement. They have 50,000 jobs under their belt from every company from startups to majors. They have hundreds of skilled employees across North America, and they are proud to serve the Bakken and the U.S. Rockies region. Of late, their lab team has come up with a chemistry-based solution for the challenging Braden Head cementing issues in the DJ and have been kicking butt in horizontal wells in Powder River. I recommend you check them out. They have pumping equipment that's almost nearly all brand new, state-of-the-art, assembled and manufactured in-house, and most importantly, since entering the U.S. market in mid-2019, they have 0 man-hours lost to safety incidences. You know how I feel about safety. As I mentioned, they are a specialist in cementing services. They've added a new product line called Magnum Infrastructure, which does cement soil stabilization work. If you haven't heard of soil stabilization, it involves taking a cement slurry, mixing it in the soil for the purpose of constructing a more robust pad, road, or other surface. You can use it with feedlots, construction sites, foundations for roads and highways, lease roads, and well pads. Brand new business, but they've already performed lots of awesome work, and I suggest you check them out. The way you can get in front of my friend Steve Moore, you can call him 310-701-3113, or you can check them out at magnumcement.com or magnuminfrastructure.com. Steve and Magnum, appreciate your sponsorship. Excited about this week's show. On with the show.
And the one thing I'll tell you, Richmond, Texas, downtown, we have a train that comes by about every 20 minutes. And so it'll literally sound like the thundering herd here. So we can do one of two things. When that goes by, we can have a train in the back.
This is work from home, baby, and we're rolling now. So we're launching with the train has left the station, and Hot Take Nation, you are with David Ramsden-Wood for another episode, and this will likely be, if it's not the 100th, it's going to be awfully darn close to the 100th episode. And I am very excited to have the man, the myth, the legend, Chuck Yates.
In his own mind. Yeah, I think. Maybe better way to put it.
Oh, I think fairly notorious. I think that you and I, in terms of notorious oil and gas execs, if we can call ourselves that, I think you and I are up there with reputations that far precede us. And the first time I heard of you was, I know you do a charity, and there was an incident with like a tattoo that may or may not have been going on your backside. And so I wanted to start right there because I had heard the story and I was like, I've never met this man. I want to meet this man. We'll talk about that charity and that roast and what you did during your time.
So YDC, Youth Development Center, after school literacy program, serves Houston's 5th Ward. I joined the board when 6 kids were in the program. We kept receipts in a shoebox. You'd get the phone call on Thursday. Hey, we're not going to make payroll tomorrow. One of those type charities. To try to raise money. At one point, Lynn Energy was actually 2/3 assets they had bought from Kane. So Mike Lynn and I were actually pretty good friends, got along really well. I took Mike out there to try to get some money out of him. And it was funny because loved Mike to death, but he was running his mouth off. Oh, we need a big event. We need to wear our tuxedos. We need to smoke cigars, raise some money for these kids. And so I kind of filed that away. About a week and a half later, Saturday night, about 10:30, knew Mike may or may not have a cocktail on a Saturday night. Sent him a text and said, hey, I thought of a fundraiser. Let's do an old school roast, a Dean Martin roast. Today's people know him as the Comedy Central roast. Let's do one. And he comes back with, oh, that's a great idea. And there are a couple of misspellings in the text. So I'm like, oh, I've got him. So I pinged back, hey, Mike, do you mind if we roast you? He pings back, yeah, I'll do that. I screenshot that and sent it to 500 people in the industry. And so upon sending that out, next morning, of course, I get a phone call from Mike. What the heck? What did I agree to? But to his credit, he went through with it. So we've done now 12 of these, the YDC roasts. And the running joke was always, hey, when are we going to roast you, Chuck? And I said, well, we always know we have one more roast because I'll always do it. But if we can find someone else to say yes, we need to do that. Well, 2 years ago, we were building a building at YDC. So it was one of those things where we committed to a $5 million building. I think we had $1 million in the bank and we had no idea where the money was coming from. And so it was going to be one of those things that at the roast, I was going to have to call and say, you know, hey, Carnelian, you can't buy a $10,000 table. I really need you to buy a $25,000 table, you know, 1 year ask only. And so that was going to be my plan on how to get more money. Well, what was interesting about that whole thing is the first person I called, who shall remain nameless, said, okay, I'll do it, but you got to be the man of the hour. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll get roasted. And anyway, it was a neat deal because generally that roast raises, call it 800,000, 850,000, and it pays the operating budget of the center for the year. The year of my roast, we did 2.5 million. And kind of the component parts of it are table sales were about $1.5 million, where normally they were 800, 850. So we were able to upsell tables to $1.5 million. And then this is going to sound like a no-brainer and really easy, but I can't tell you the amount of brain cells that were killed on this. I mean, complicated mergers had less mind power put to this than us coming up with this. But we needed, the problem with the roast is one person says yes to the table, right? And pays 10,000 for it or whatever the case may be. But then they invite 9 other rich people who haven't given any money to the charity. So that's always been, how do we get the other 9 people? So we conceived of this idea of I would get a tattoo on stage. And here's how we did it. Here's how we did it. Again, sounds easy, but we killed a lot of brain cells trying to think this through. You know, we went at one point with, why don't we just auction off whatever the tattoo is? And maybe NCAP or Quantum or Natural Gas Partners would step up and do something. But then you're like, well, you know, if we get Quantum at $50,000 just to make up a number, that's going to be the max, right? How do we collectively get all of the 9 people at every table to pitch in? So here was kind of the shtick we went with. Carl Brinsicki played MC for the night. Normally I play that role, but Carl played it since I was getting roasted. And he comes out, and what he does is he says, okay, everybody, we're going to put 3 tattoos up on the screen, and we're going to choose one as the audience. And it was a little pink unicorn thing with like a, you know.
So you would have been like you would have been like a My Little Pony?
Yeah, My Little Pony, you know, yeah, My Little Kitty, whatever it was. Then the next one was an oil derrick. But then the third one, and this was kind of by design, Carl's not a stupid guy, right? The third one made it look like I was wearing a bikini. It was a whale tail that would have come up above my my shorts or my jeans. And so the whale tail overwhelmingly won, right? And so what Carl said was, here's the deal. Take out the sheet of paper in front of you, write down your pledge, and that money's going to the charity no matter what. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It goes to the charity. The only way Chuck gets out of this is if he will do 2x the amount we, the audience, do, and then he can get whatever he wants on his rear end. But a tattoo is going to happen here on stage. And so anyway, and I know I'm going way on about this story, but this is the really cool thing. So juxtaposition, a charity in the 5th Ward in Houston goes bankrupt through fraud. And what happens in a situation in the state of Texas is the state comes in, takes the money, and they give it to another charity that's doing the closest thing to the charity. And so So they take them, the state takes the money and they have a hearing to see which charity they're going to give it to. So, the Boys and Girls Club shows up with pick a big law firm, Fulbright and Jaworski, Vincent Elkins, whoever. The YMCA shows up with equally big law firm, Baker Botts. YDC shows up with a pro bono lawyer who asked our executive director one set of questions that was supposed to be for a board member and vice versa. It was just a complete mess. But for whatever reason, the judge just really liked what YDC was doing. And the judge said, all right, everybody in my chambers, and turns to the chairman of the board of YDC and says, hey, we got $500,000 here. Can you raise $500,000, i.e. a match, and I'll give you this money? And as we do at YDC, the answer is always yes. And then let's go figure out how to do it. So Jennifer Hance, to her credit, was like, yes, we can absolutely do this. So anyway, we said yes. About a week later, called back with the tattoo idea, said, board member is going to get a tattoo on stage. Will you, can that 500,000 count as the match if we get there? And the judge loved the idea, thought it was hysterical. Long-winded way of saying, I have $1 million tattoo on my ass. Because
I love it.
Yeah. So yeah, right there. So we had 1,000 people, downtown Houston. I don't know what the name of the venue is called now. It used to be Bayou Music Center, the Verizon Center, but we had 1,000 people there right in front of God and everyone. I got pulled down my pants and got a tattoo on my butt.
Well, I mean, so first of all, I commend you for that. And I wanted to start there because I think for those, although there's probably very few who don't know you, some might know of you, but maybe don't know that story. And one of the things I've found getting to know you over the last 3 or 4 months is you're thoughtful and you're surprising, and your love of people and charity is really commendable. And so I'm curious, as you look out over Houston, which is a very close city to my heart, although I've never lived there. I've spent a tremendous amount of time there. I love the people of Houston. I love what the city has become since 2006. And I'm sure you'd agree with me that when I first started coming down after Anadarko bought Carnegie and I was transferred to the US, I would go to Houston probably once a month. And just to see the evolution of both the downtown and the restaurants and the culture and the multiculturalism and everything about H-Town was so positive, but it's so levered to oil. And 2020 has been a horrible year. So as you think about YDC and other charities and as the city itself, how does it get off the mat and get back to the great things that it was doing? And is $52 oil or wherever we're at today enough? What do you think for that?
Here's some interesting history on that, because we always talk about how levered we are to the oil business. And you think about all previous oil crashes, actually Houston grows and thrives during an oil crash, because what happens is someone headquartered in Houston closes their Tulsa office, they close the Denver office, they close New Orleans, they close Oklahoma City, they fire half the people, and then they bring the other half back to the home office. So we actually, during previous downturns, see growth in Houston for that reason. Now, so that's kind of one thing to keep in the back of your mind. Another thing to keep in the back of your mind is, I think, Houston, we have the climate of a third world country. I mean, it's just horrible. It's hot, it's humid, it's cruddy.
I do try and avoid it in July and August, if I'm honest.
Oh yeah. I mean, just a mess. It's also not a very pretty city. I mean, we're flat, concrete. Because of the water table being very salty, we can't really grow tall trees, right? Because the roots go down, they get salt water, they die. So we're not a very pretty city at that. But being the hub of the energy business, what's cool about that is, and this because you're in it, because of the cycles in the oil and gas business, everyone's been broke at one point or another. I mean, no one can say I started out on top and I rode it all the way through. And so the culture in Houston is very much the CEO of the company's best friend is liable to be the janitor. And when times are good, the janitor's flying around on the private plane with the CEO and they're going and doing this and that. And when times are bad, the CEO is liable to go sleep on the janitor's couch for a while, trying to figure out what, the next step's going to be. And so I don't think we have a class system like other cities do. And so I think that's what's always made us the most charitable city, I think, on the planet. Is it's really hard for you to get a phone call and hear about someone downtrodden and not be able to personalize it, going, oh, wow, that was me 10 years ago. That was me 12 years ago, whatever the case may be. So, I used to always hate when management teams would walk into my office and say, well, this time it's different. Because, it's never different. I mean, everything just repeats itself, right? But I don't know if this time it's different. I mean, we had a fundamental shift, and the age of the driller, I think, is officially over. I mean, I just can't see us. There's no reason to drill another well in the United States for the next 5 years. I mean, keep going.
No. So you tee that up perfectly, because just a little. We're not going to go all the way through 2020, but if you go back to the last week of October, before the election, blue wave, red wave, split Congress, don't know. I was always shocked, given the results this week of the Senate runoff in Georgia, where the Democrats won both seats. Like, that seemed to me to be like the most likely outcome, and yet the market ran on the fumes of 45 days of it split. But now we can print all the stimulus in the world. But all of this comes around to inflation. It comes round to oil price, and we're sitting in a $50 world, which arguably is still not super commercial, but you can probably make 10% on some of the returns. And we're seeing companies ramp up frac spreads, ramp up rigs. And I tend to agree with you that there isn't really a reason to drill except to hide the pickle with your debt and your debt to cash flow and some of the bankruptcy covenants. And how do you balance that as an industry? And then what role does private equity, which I know you have a lot of experience with, what role does private equity play in that go forward, given the current state of the market in the US?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's less or more important than $50 oil was just the amount of capital, wherever it came from. Is it cash flow? Is it debt? Is it equity? And I mean, if you look at it, I mean, you just look back to, call it, 2010, or maybe even back to 2005. I mean, we sucked up so much capital from everywhere, whether that was private equity, the public markets, debt, and the like. I mean, we were incredibly cash flow negative during that whole time, sucking it all up. And now you sit there and you go, okay, well, oil's back to 50. We have some cash flow. We can be sustainable. I still think that's a drop in the bucket compared to all that external cash we had. And I don't think that external cash comes back into the business, even if we hit $75 or $80 oil. I think, number one, we just burned investors too much over the last decade for them to suddenly go, oh, well, oil's at 80, all's forgiven. Because I just don't see that. That's number one. Then number two, I can't imagine being a commercial bank and having to go sit in the banking committee. And I don't know if AOC's on the banking committee, but your evil Wall Street. Oh, and by the way, you're financing all the polluters out there. So, I mean, I can totally see, and we're seeing this, that the commercial banks are drawing back. And then ESG is real. I mean, this whole environmental movement, the climate change movement. I mean, my son lives like the greatest life on the planet, and it's all financed by oil dollars. And if he had his druthers tomorrow, he'd ban every oil and gas company. I mean, there really does feel like something different. So, when I look at the industry, what I think you have to do is, one, do not assume any reversion to the mean. I mean, we are not going back to the way this was. You're not going to go out and get a $500 million commitment to go look for deals. You're not going to be able to buy acreage and flip it. And I think the other big fundamental shift that's happening is nickels now matter. I mean, if you look back over the whole industry, we would spend money on technology if it allowed us to, in effect, what I call get another lottery ticket. So back in the 90s, when you use 3D seismic, you could image a bump and find 20 million barrels of oil. Okay, great. I'll spend money on 3D seismic. Doesn't mean I'm going to automate my books. Doesn't mean my land files are going to be digital. I'm going to keep those in a filing cabinet. And so, then when we move into the age of the driller, sure, I'm going to spend a lot of money figuring out how to do a 97 stage frac. I'm going to spend a lot of money figuring out how to drill a 3-mile lateral and the like. Again, I'm not going to focus on nickels and dimes automating it because it doesn't give me another lottery ticket. But today it's different. I mean, nickels and dimes actually matter. And so, the role I think private equity plays going forward is less. Everybody seems to think private equity going forward is going to be the financier of last resort. And because they're there, they have money, they're going to be able to get outrageous returns, buy at the bottom and all this. I don't see that happening, because if you're an equity owner of a field, why would you sell it to give somebody a 25% rate of return? Because you don't have another use of proceeds for the money you get for selling that field, right? There's no well to go drill that you're going to make 100% rate of return on and the like. So I don't really see that happening. That's why we've seen record low deal volume, right? It's just, why in the hell would you sell it? So actually, where I think private equity could play a role, and I'm not sure they're going to, but where they could, is one, technology to automate everything that hasn't been automated yet. And I hate to say this from the humanity side of it, but unfortunately, your biggest cost is people, and technology allows you to get rid of people. And so back office, digitizing things, using AI to figure out pump speeds. I think there's a ton to do there. And I stole this from Tommy Noose, and I've said it on other podcasts. I mean, we're in the age of the plumber now. I mean, all the United States ought to be doing is squeezing every penny out of every well we're producing. We shouldn't be drilling. But there's a lot of technology you can do to actually make that more profitable. And nickels and dimes matter these days. So I actually think kind of niche-y technologies to help on that front, private equity could play a role on. This is really interesting. I was talking to somebody the other day. Did you know literally they dropped their incident cost and dropped their pumpers cost by just not allowing their pumper to ever put their truck in reverse? So long as you're just driving forward, and they literally mapped out all the pumpers and going through the field where they never had to put the truck in reverse. So they stopped having health and safety incidents, wear and tear on the trucks, et cetera. So when people call me and say, and I don't view private equity any different as a 27-year-old choosing to spend 50 hours a week doing something, it's all equity dollars, whether it's big dollars or your time. So I always tell folks you got to figure out how to adjust in the age of the plumber and make money there, do things better there, or you need to create a unique twist on something, do something different than historically what's been done, because we're not going back to the olden days. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and I totally agree that we moved, and we talked about it at One Energy a lot when we were going to sell. And we were very fortunate from a timing standpoint, because we started in March of 2016 roughly, and sold in, the last of the deals closed, I think, Halloween 2018, something like that. And that was like in the last 6 years since 2014, that was amongst the only 9-month window that was open. Right. That was open to sell. But we talked a lot about the model moving from a acquire, prove up and flip to a drill your returns. And in a drill your returns model, you need the most efficient company. And I know you've seen this at your private equity, and also when you see non-op wells come in for working interest you may have, is the difference. You can have an $11 million AFE from partner one, drilling the exact same well 2 miles away from big public company who's spending $9 million because they're running 4, 6, 8, 10 rigs. And that $2 million of nickels that we never really cared about previously as private equity sponsored companies, it was like, just get the well in the ground, see what happens. Now every $100,000 increment matters so much to the returns. And on top of that, you have this massive volatility in commodity prices. You have ESG. The business is just different. And I totally agree with you. We're not going back to the way it was, which takes some of the joy of our industry out. When you're not able to spend $25,000 on a table to have 1,000 people at a roast because,
right,
that things change. Do you think that the consolidation brings technology from the publics, or do you really think it's the private equity guys that are having to force it through their portfolio companies and like smash coing as we've seen of late?
You know, I've got anecdotal stuff there. So I don't know if I have a good trend analysis answer for you, but literally over the last kind of 6 to 8 months, I've had 4 or 5 what I'll call, 50, 60-year-old white guy CEO types, reach out and say, hey, you got to teach me about this technology stuff. What's going on there? What can we do on that front? So again, from the camp of, always hate to say this time is different, it might actually be different that public companies care about that, and maybe they can lead the charge. Because, at the end of the day, unless we run healthy businesses, we're not going to ever get capital back. And so, literally a nickel a barrel. I mean, if you can just track your production better and match it with your hedges better. So literally you're 78% hedged instead of being 68% hedged. That might be the difference between bankruptcy or not, in certain situations, given how volatile things are. So I've seen some evidence from public companies that, hey, there's going to be an interest doing this. I don't know that I've really seen private equity guys lead the charge on that, but I would think they would be the natural vehicle to do it, because that's always been where the entrepreneurship is, and I tell folks that, I said, man, if you can show somebody that instead of $12 a barrel, LOE, you can actually get it down to 8, and here are the material steps to do it, and you're uniquely qualified to do it, whether it's you're the world's best at using AI on pumps or whatever the case may be, then yeah, I mean, you might be able to talk private equity into going and buying stuff and paying PDP, PV8 for it because they know they can make some money. But yeah, I don't have a good answer for you there. And maybe it's just because people don't know.
Yeah, well, it certainly is going to be interesting. And when we talk about nickels and dimes and plumbers and the role of companies, I think a lot about hedging. And so I wrote a post sort of tongue in cheek at the beginning of 2020 that we had just assassinated. I mean, it feels like it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, but we had just assassinated an Iranian general. Oil was 63. And I had written a post that says, if every company is not taking the opportunity to hedge the absolute maximum amount of volume, like 100% of PDP plus your capital at this level, you're crazy. Because why expose yourself? Now, you and I have talked about this. I fully believed, because of declines in the US, because of we've over drilled, inventory quality was dropping, wells were drilled too tightly together, fracs were so big that they were interfering with other wells, and all that manifested in declines. And from November of 2019 to March of 2020, before coronavirus hit, the US had in fact declined oil production every single month. So setting up for a great price, but then black swans happen and oil goes to negative 37. Do you think that companies learn from this, and that their boards are saying, I want 78, 85, 90% of my production hedged this year? Because I feel like the Saudis might be tricking people. With this 1 million barrel cut this year that's driven oil above 50, I feel like that sets the stage for US E&Ps to go frack wells, to go drill wells, to get all fired up again. And it's the good old days, just give me one more boom. And then 3 months from now, pull the carpet out, jack production 1.5 million barrels a day, and get screwed. The way to fix that is hedges. Our industry hasn't typically been big fans of hedging. What do you think happens with hedging in 2021? And are you looking for that in the Q4 announcements from companies?
One of my favorite jokes when we were talking about coronavirus being a black swan, it's like, why do I have a freaking pond out behind my house with 100 of them in there? Because it seems like, black swan's supposed to be once every 100 years or whatever. And it seems like we have one every other year, the housing bubble, right, et cetera. But, historically so I've been in the oil and gas business, call it 25 years, 30 years. Historically, investors wanted exposure to the commodity price, so you were actually penalized for hedging. And Louis Dreyfus, who you won't remember because you're too young, But back in kind of the mid 90s, they actually came out and said, our business model is to drill a well, hedge 5 years of it, lock in 1.3 times our money, and ultimately a 30% rate of return on that drilling. We have the parent company, Louis Dreyfus, the commodity traders, so we can get off the best trades. And I mean, they traded at 1.5 times EBITDA. I mean, the market just hated it. And so, you know, it's pretty interesting. You know, then you saw when shit hits the fan and people go bankrupt and stuff, then investors, well, maybe we should have, you know, hedged some. And also, I think the market's kind of been bipolar on this. And here's unfortunately where I get on my soapbox. So, you know, if you need to go to the bathroom or go ahead and get another cup of coffee or something, this has become kind of my pet peeve since I got the boot from Kane, and I've had nothing to do but kind of sit around and do podcasts and eat lunch with you for 2 hours. But I have no idea why any investor is out there seeking alpha in the oil and gas business. I mean, you know, the whole notion that Chevron, pay me 2% because I'm going to tell you that Chevron's going to beat Exxon by 120 basis points. Oh, but I missed the fact that oil fell, you know, 50% and I lost 60% of your money. I don't see why anybody does that. I mean, if you think, I don't know what the right number is, so I'll just make this up, but it's somewhere around here. I mean, 85 to 90% of investors should have something tied to the price of oil, because oil is the big dog fuel out there. It's 1/3 of all fuel consumed in the world. It is GDP, right? It's 90% of transportation fuels. The whole reason Amazon can deliver stuff to our houses because all the cheap oil we provided. And ultimately, what is the diversifier in your portfolio if you have technology, healthcare, bonds, this and that? It's not whether Exxon turns on, you know, this field or that field. It's the price of oil. I mean, if the price of oil stays really low, it helps out Amazon. It helps out, you know, the airlines, et cetera. And so that's my big pet peeve is I think investors ought to sit back and say, you know, do I really want to own an oil and gas company and screw around with management teams and whether they're hedged and what the balance sheet looks like? Do I want to do all that? And there are people that do it. Dan Pickering does that really well. I'd give money to Dan and say, Dan, you go figure out the winners and the losers. But for most people, it doesn't make any sense. And so where I go kind of with this is because I think investors should just somehow get exposure to the price, however impacts them. If you own a cab company in Las Vegas and you're doing really well these days, Corona notwithstanding the tourism business, but because gasoline prices are low, you're doing really well, you might want to go long oil prices because if they rise, your cab company will hurt. You need to think about energy like that. So when it comes to whether companies should be hedging or not, I think you have this bipolar investor group that's not really sure what they want these days. At one point, they wanted price exposure. Then we went through all the crap we went. Now, companies don't even really track commodity prices. The correlation used to be 90 some odd percent. Now it's, you know, depending on what period you run it, it's as low as 50%. So, you know, the investors aren't really sure whether they want that or not. Management should want to do it. I mean, if management's goal is to make sure they're still around and the like, you should be hedging. I mean, you should spend $1 and you should have a base case that shows you're going to make whatever return, 30, 35% based on pricing assumptions. And if you could lock in those prices for as long as you can lock them in, you ought to take 30 to 35. Because if you as management are not locking that in, then you're gambling on price as well. And I will say the big overall picture is we've all figured out none of us can guess price.
That's 100%. I mean, and you can have all the macro overlay in the world, but our business is the commodity price. And I mean, it is truly amazing. If you went back to October 26th and you talked to a lot of people and said, hey, PS, January 7th, oil's going to be 51. People would have looked at you like you had 9 heads because there was no basis. And then all of a sudden, money flows and just the euphoria just moved to oil, and there's sort of this cascade. So let's talk about your biggest learning looking back on your career at Kane, but in energy. You know, you shared a lot on that one in terms of hedging and who should bet and the role of energy and alpha versus beta and investing. But what would you tell other energy professionals who are maybe 30 or 35 in their career right now? That was a really big learning for you that you would share with them if you could.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to steal this one, and this may get me kicked out of the energy business, but here goes on this one. You know, at the end of the day, if you want to be a good investor, invest in something you hate, because, you know, if you like music, don't go out and buy venues because you're going to hire your favorite bands to come play and you're not going to make any money, right? But you got to sit front row for My Chemical Romance, right? And you're like, whoa, this is great. You know, if you like airplanes and you're flying around in planes and all, you're not really thinking about the balance sheet up there when you're doing it. So if you're going to be an investor of some sort, choose an industry you hate. And I've got to be very careful how I say this, but I hate oil and gas. I mean, think about what we do. We spend all our money drilling a well, and then we turn it on to find out what we've got. I mean, how many businesses do you literally almost bet everything you have to do that and then turn it on? And to this day, it's still amazing how little in the way we understand reservoir, you know, all things considered with the amount of money we're betting. Now, I want to make sure I say I love the people. I don't think there are any better people on the planet than energy folks, but just conceptually as a business, you know, I'm not a big fan of oil and gas. That being said, I wish my hatred of oil and gas would have come out more, and I would have been more cynical kind of along the way. And I think you can be cynical without being an asshole. And I wish I would have done more of that kind of in my career looking back.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, there's a lot there to unpack. Totally agree. Because I mean, if you love it, and I love the industry, and when I do talk to young people, and I've been on record saying during 2020 that my view is in the next 3 years, 80% of jobs that existed January 1st, 2020 are gone. And the reason is through, you know, obviously layoffs, through retirements, but also through huge mergers, where the only way to get savings, and as you said earlier in the conversation, people is one of the very few costs that you can control. And that truly are people.
And add technology to that. I think all the things you said are correct. I also think there is a sliver of that's going to be technology, because unfortunately, when you digitize all your land files, you don't need as many clerks.
Yeah. Well, and I think on that point is people say that pushback is no, I really want this. You know, I want to stay in this industry. It's really important to me. I love the people. And I remind them that, you know, from 2008 to 2014, we weren't looking at nickels and dimes. Like, I have a friend who worked at Procter & Gamble early in her career, and to get a $25,000 citywide flyer drop took like 9 levels of approval. And then here's like a kid 6 months out of school who could call coil tubing, put it on standby for 25 grand with no real need for it. And we were just throwing money out the door. And I said, so part of what you love is that we have a lot of money to spend. Part of what you love is we have a lot of benefits, because in 1985 and in 1993 and in 2000, we went through an era where it was like it is today. We laid off a whole bunch of people. We had to attract them, and we never really ratcheted salaries down, which I think this year they will. And so a lot of the things that we loved, ultimately came down to the people and not the business. And I think sometimes we get confused about, you know, this business. I say, you know, maybe it's controversial. It's not that hard a business. Drilling wells is easy. Producing wells over 35 years and dealing with scale and H2S and casing and safety and all that, that's much harder. But like at the end of the day, there's rock, there's a type curve, there's cost, and there's rate of return, and there's oil price. Like, that's just not a complex business. So it will be.
Let me cut you off real quick, because
Yeah.
I want to say again, kind of back on my soapbox. I think you made a great point in that literally there is rock, and that rock will throw off a financial forecast of some sort, right? If it's production, we're going to have what are the reserves coming out? What's the price? What's the LOE? If that rock needs to be drilled, we come up with costs for drilling it, fracking it, the like, and all that. At the end of the day, it's evaluating that rock and figuring out what the financial forecast is and what's the appropriate rate of return for that amount of risk that matters. And one of the gripes, and I don't want to say this because I love my former LPs, don't get me wrong, but one of the gripes I always had is a lot of investors in oil and gas don't understand rock, right? They hear TOC, porosity, stuff like that, eyes glaze over, and they get so fixated on business plans. Oh, is it non-op? Oh, is it acquire and exploit? Is it this or that? And I always used to say, and unfortunately I kind of had to say it under my breath, but it was, hey, it's the evaluation of that rock that matters. And whether I have a non-operated working interest, or whether I bought production, or whether I bought acreage and we're going to drill it, basically I have said I believe in that rock more than the whole rest of the market, right? I mean, because I bought it, it was a high bid. And I have to be right about that belief to be able to make any money kind of given that. And I think that's hugely underappreciated by the investing community out there, because you sit there and you talk business strategies and all that, and you opine on that. And I always kind of said, that doesn't really matter. If I get a good piece of rock and I'm right about the forecast, I don't care how I did it, And so one, I wanted to say that. Go ahead.
No, I love that point, because and I don't usually talk about One Energy. I always still find it funny that I think I'm better known as like a blogger and the LinkedIn guy and the guy that now does a podcast than I was for the 20 years I spent in industry. But the reason One Energy worked, and the reason I think that oil and gas investing is so bad, and I mean in public companies today in valuation, is there's only so much rock, you own it, you know how many wells realistically should go in there. And my approach, even going back to 2014, I gave a presentation to the SPE in Denver when oil was like 75. And I said, the Bakken is so far over drilled that people are going to use $75 oil as an excuse to drop from 220 rigs to, I don't know, 50, because like there's no inventory left, because 24 wells in 3 benches of the 3 forks of Bakken makes no sense. It's probably 2 Bakken, 2 3 forks stacked with a big frac, or maybe 3 and 3, but it's not what guys are running. Like, we've totally screwed up, and no one's looking at the data because it's really obvious. And when we did One Energy, our map, I drew a line of death, and I said, if you go east of this, I would not own a single acre no matter the price. And we took a different approach than other private equity guys were like, oh, I would take 5,000 acres and really speculative, because if I own the 5,000 acres and I have 5 other 1,000 acres, when people pay me $1 per acre metric, it's going to look better. So I really need that rock. But our approach was, I drew a line of death, and anything on that side for $100 an acre, we wouldn't have taken. And then our spacing was based on all the math of the entire basin. And we said 10 wells is the most you're ever going to drill. Devin was saying 24. Concha was saying, whatever they were saying. And I said 10. So we said 10 wells, here's the rock, I like it, here's the curves, here's the net asset value. And if we get close to it, we'll sell it. And if we don't get close to it, we'll drill it. And I think that was lost because people were talking investor strategy. And I'm like, the rock is a rock. It was put there 300 million years ago. You can't frack it any better than we already do. So you're just drilling it and rolling the dice to what was laid there. And it sounds like we have a very similar approach from an investing background and an engineering background.
Well, you know what else was interesting, kind of along those lines, if you think about it, is we started drilling horizontally, and we started, multi-stage fracking, let's call it mid 2000s, right? We did it for natural gas. And I mean, I hate to sound like I'm on Sesame Street, but nothing cures low oil prices like low oil prices. Nothing cures high oil prices like high oil prices. That was natural gas, right? I mean, natural gas hit 14 in July of 2007. We did what Americans do, you know, in that crucible of private enterprise, private ownership of minerals, technology, available capital markets. We figured it out, right? What was interesting in hindsight that I didn't have an appreciation for was the people that actually made the big, huge home runs, kind of call it from mid 2000s up till we get, you know, call it 2017, 18, you know, your last window to sell. Actually, the folks that made the big splashes in a weird way ignored the data, and they looked at the romance. And, you know, so, I mean, one of the best engineers I've ever worked with said no to the Bakken because they looked at all the data, they did all the math, that we, you know, people that made some money said, no, I bet if we go from 800 pounds on the fracks to 3,500, you know, we'll see this uplift. And studying that uplift, when your analogy is like 10 states away, I mean, that's Ouija board type stuff. I mean, it really is. I mean, there's some, you know, I'm not saying it's absolute divining rod bad in terms of how we did things. And so, you know, the speculation is actually what led to people capturing assets. And then when it got harder and you had more data and more science was necessary to make the right calls, the people that had been successful were successful because they had, in effect, the balls to go out and look at the Ouija board and buy it in the first place. So I do think that's part of the reason why our industry suffered, was that kind of romantic view. It's really, if you looked at, and I'll get this data wrong because I haven't looked at it in a while, but I'll be close enough. If you looked at the individual well performance, just the improvement in IP30s, if you looked at like 2015, it was up 30% year to year, 16 was up 35, 17 was up 30. When you start getting into kind of 17 and 18, the numbers were still that high. But if you actually took out the wells that Chevron and Exxon drilled in the Permian, because it's not like they went and bought that acreage. They were just Johnny come lately. If you said, okay, we've been drilling for a while here, new technology, all this, and let's take out that quote unquote virgin acreage that those guys have owned forever. Actually, I believe it was 17. It may have been 18. The improvement was like 1%. And then if you looked at 18 or 19, it was down 10. And then if you rolled into the start of 2020, it was down 15%. And so the music stopped on what could make this better. You know, the bigger frac, more sand, et cetera.
And I would say, I mean, that was the basis of my, I think I called it Peak Oil USA, and I wrote it in September of 2019, which feels like 50 years ago. But I had looked at all the data on a lateral length normalized basis, and you could see that every basin, with the exception of the Bakken, had peaked in 2016 in terms of productivity of the first year's worth of oil, not IP, but the first year's, which obviously correlates to IP. And it was in part because we were drilling wells instead of 1,000 feet apart and having a B factor of 1.4 or 1.3 or 1.2, we were drilling them 300 feet apart, and we were making, not only was the B like 0.8 because they were sucking from each other's rock, but we also made the terminal decline like 10%. And so it was really easy to mask that with the first 90 days of performance. But over the first year, that steepness of the decline was so severe. I think the best thing coming out of 2020 is people have really looked at their spacing, and no longer can management teams say, hey, Chuck, we need more inventory next year for us to book. And the engineer goes, well, we don't have any more rock. You didn't give me a land budget, and there's no one for us to buy. I'll just half the well spacing. Ta-da! We have double the inventory. Yay! Well, what happens to reserves? Well, I'll probably change jobs in 3 years. I'll be a private equity. So it's probably going to be down 40%, but don't tell anybody. And so now all that's come to roost with the low activity in 2020. Let's talk about you and what you're doing now. You left Kane in April, and I think you and I have had a similar journey in that we were very busy and active participants in the industry, and we both, for differing reasons, have been set on this path, and now we're Now we're media personalities.
You're way too kind. You can go ahead and say it. I got shown the door.
My book was written about the number of times I get shown the door. And I think it's fair to say for the listeners, those who've listened to me before and those who know you, I mean, we are big personalities and we're not likely to take a knee and kiss the ring, just generally. And we're always going to say where we come from. But I don't say it to talk about our previous employers. I say it to say we've both been set on a journey in an interesting time, 2020 coronavirus. You know, social media hadn't been a big thing for oil and gas people in particular. We've seen a proliferation of podcasts. What do you think of the future for this forum of discussion, both for our industry and does it help? And then what happens to the media and social media and like long form communication like podcasts in your opinion?
You know what's really interesting, and I'm on, I think yesterday episode 10 got dropped of Chuck Yates Needs a Job. So I'm 10 episodes in, and in effect I'm really 8 episodes in, because the first 2 I released 3 episodes all at once when I started. And so the first 2 episodes just no one's really listened to, but I get it, because the third episode was BRV and Kitty and the hour and a half of drinking White Claw and talking about private equity and the industry. By the way, really funny story there is, we distorted their voices so that they could remain anonymous. And what was really funny about that is we recorded, and those 2, he's or she's, whatever the case may be, were sitting in the same spot through the same microphone, same computer. And Kitty would say periodically, hey, Chuck, it's Kitty, to differentiate his or her voice from BRV. When we had to distort, because it was one feed, we distorted them both the same way so that they sound similar. And so the audience feels like when they listen to the distorted thing, oh, because they sound the same, Kitty is saying, hey, Chuck, it's Kitty. Kitty is saying, hey, Chuck, it's Kitty, because he or she was drunk. I mean, it was White Claw. I mean, we were trying to edit out all the White Claw cans going pop and all that. But anyway, so me and the engineers that work on it have a big, huge laugh about that. And of course, nobody knows that's what was actually going on. But here's kind of the interesting thing I've learned digging into the data. When I do a podcast that talks about energy, and, I've done BRV Kitty, we did Buddha-gate, I had Energy Cynic on, Energy Credit's going to come on this weekend. Next Wednesday, Katie Maynard will drop. Katie and when I do energy type stuff, I get 3 to 3.5 times the downloads than if I do something different. My kind of something different is I did this really what I thought was very funny fake newscast of John W.B. Rich getting kicked off Twitter. Least downloaded podcast I've done, right? And then we had Sarah Catalin come on, who's a day trader or a swing trader, as she calls it, which I'm kind of fascinated by. There's a whole story there about, Goldman Sachs says 1/3 of the market are people like Sarah that literally sit at their computer and trade every day. And that's how they make their living. What's fascinating about that, none of the investment banks know who that person is. So there's going to be a big disruption there in terms of companies figuring out, how do I sell my stock to Sarah as opposed to paying, a big investment bank 7% to go sell it to Fidelity.
Right.
But anyway, so non-energy stuff just doesn't download that well. And so I was kind of perplexed by that. But in terms of talking with Colin and Jake, Colin's take on it is, well, yeah, Chuck, I mean, energy, you actually may know a little bit about what you're talking about, and somebody might find that interesting. If you're talking entertainment, I mean, somebody can go, you're then competing with downloading an Adam Sandler movie off Netflix, or you're competing with the Joe Rogan podcast and the like. So it's interesting in that, what the medium does is it allows for a lot of diversification, no entry cost. Anybody can kind of talk about what they want, but at the same time, it's very demanding in that if you're not providing something specific, you're not going to have any sort of audience. And so I think, because I would have thought that digital wildcatters could have people coming on and talk about music and movies and all that. And I don't think that's the path they're going to go down. And I don't think if they did, it would make much in the way of sense. You really kind of have to be narrow, specific, and the like. And so I think that's kind of what the podcast medium does for you is sort of the specificity, but it's very, very niche.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think about Joe Rogan now, and again, this is a timing thing, right? And I think Bill Gates falls in the same category. Mark Zuckerberg falls in the same category. Michael Dell, they happen to be on the scene at the same time as the thing that was about to blow up. They were the first. And I know I've heard Rogan talk about the fact that he's been doing a podcast since 2009, and he would generally be the most generalist because he covers climbing and investors, right, and entertaining, but he's also the first. Therefore, like when there was no one else to listen to, that's who everyone gravitated to. And then now, because the barriers to entry of this platform, it is very niche, and then competes, obviously with the CNNs and the social medias of the world. So you're at episode 10. What's the biggest takeaway you've learned from being a podcast host and an interviewer?
So one, just mortified by the sound of my own voice. I still kind of just cringe every time, because what I'll do is I'll record one of these things and then I'll go listen to it 2 or 3 times. Because generally the way I do mine is we wind up talking 2.5 hours, and I try to edit it down and the like. So I wind up having to listen to it multiple times. So one, just mortified by the sound of my voice. 2, I say things like, the interesting thing is I will say that 587 times a podcast. And I'm just like, really? Do I not know any more words? I went to college. I took English in college. How can I not have a bigger vocabulary? And then kind of the final thing I've learned, and I got this from you because you told me this, and it's very true. The more you do this, the more you figure out how to be a good listener. I mean, you're the one that gave me that tip, and it is so true. I mean, episode 1, my best friend Fish and I, it's literally like, okay, I'll talk for 5 minutes. You talk for 5 minutes. I'll talk for 5 minutes. You talk for 5 minutes. You get to this last episode I downloaded. I don't know if you heard, did you hear about Pizzagate? So
I've heard about a Pizzagate, but I don't know if it's the Pizzagate you're talking about.
So the short version, Lindsay 5280 on Twitter tweeted out that she was stuck going on a date with a guy who's going to come over to her house and cook a steak. And it morphed into 72 hours on Twitter called Meatgate, because the guy had stolen the picture of a steak that he had, so it was really funny. So the next weekend, she actually has this date, and she tweets out, hey, I'm going to, my date's showing up. I haven't taken a shower yet and all that. Ugh, I can't believe I'm on it. So I don't really know Lindsay that well. We've DM'd every once in a while. So I decided it'd be really funny to just fill her house with flowers from the guy, mortify her that this is, and of course I can't find a florist because they're all closed at that point. I'm eating dinner with my parents, and my dad looks at me like, send her a pizza. They deliver all night. So we just continuously sending her pizzas that night. And what's so funny about it is she's live tweeting this all, like, who in the hell is sending me pizzas? And so anyway, it's actually really funny. If you read Lindsay's tweets from the night of her date, and I've saved some surprises on things we were delivering to her date as well. But where I was going with this is I actually think she and I have a conversation, and it's because I was able to listen, and it was a lot better than episode 1.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a really interesting skill, and I think, if I were to reform education, there's a lot of things I would do for high school. Number one is I would teach financial literacy, and that sometimes just because you want something doesn't mean you should buy something. And I
Right.
think talk about saving money and all of that. But the other one, I would teach people to podcast and create a product that is entertaining to listen to, and I think it really does make you a better listener, which I think would make people better leaders in industry, even if they're not hosting podcasts. So I like your point on niche, and I think that the skill of it is certainly the listening. So, and I have personally, you and I had a great lunch, and I wanted to thank you again for that. If you don't know Chuck, Chuck loves wine. And we had a very, 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 very lovely bottle of wine with lunch that day. And but I said this to open the show, and I'll say it to close the show. You're a very thoughtful guy. You're a surprising guy. I think for those who didn't know you before listening, I really enjoy listening to you and hearing your insights. And I am very excited both for your growth in the podcast, but the other things that you're going to no doubt do in this industry and in others. And your continued work with YDC and charity, I think, is essential. So you're a great man, and I really appreciate you.
Hey, I appreciate you having me on. I love to hear myself speak. So giving me an hour to come do this, I really appreciate. And I'd like to make as many kudos back to you. I enjoyed lunch a lot. I've loved getting to know you as well. Ackerman said, yeah, you guys will be good friends. And so I definitely think if we're not there, we're on the path. But you've done some great things with the hot take of the day. You've done some great things with the podcast you do. So you should be commended as well.
Well, I really appreciate that. So Chuck Yates, follow him on Twitter. He is at Nimble Fatty, has some great content that comes out. He's also the Galactic Viceroy on LinkedIn. Great guy to get to know and to follow. And Chuck, until next time, we'll see you.
Take care.
All right, listeners, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.